and welcome to Nocturnal Transmissions, the fortnightly podcast that brings you dark tales, both old and new, performed by your humble narrator, Kristin Holland. Sorry to bug ya, but we have another creepy, crawly little tale we'd like to share with you. Nocturnal Transmissions is proud to present Jon Michael Kelley's A Mimicry of Night. At no particularly advantageous point, Dario Frey left the beaten path that cut through the heart of Leighton Woods, a sizable run of coniferous acreage that, save for a tiny cemetery and a struggling barbed wire fence, was indistinguishable from the national forest that bordered its fringes. Now, in the thick of things, several miles from the nearest town, he trudged along with a watchful eye. In his left hand was a small metal cage, the preferred enclosure for today's quarry. He was on the hunt, his khaki shorts, climbing boots, and safari hat flattering the task. Ponderosa pine and aspen congregated here, as did juniper, poplar, and any number of deciduous shrubs, all now in full dress. The sun was intervening through a ragged canopy, splashing limbs and boughs in its descent, then soaking finally, patchily, into the dry, needle-littered ground. Butterscotch, the resin scent of the ponderosa, was unusually bold this afternoon, sweetening the tang of yucca and pine. Dario blamed the uncommon heat for that enhancement. It was the dark days of summer, a time that had, decades earlier, prematurely ushered his mother into her own eternal season. She'd raised him in the absence of a derelict father, and it was always her determination to see him achieve his dreams, as menacing as some of them were to her feminine sensibilities. Even when invited, bugs and snakes could make for intimidating houseguests. How she would squeal when surprised by one slithering across the kitchen floor, scaling the drapes, or hiding under the toaster. He'd loved her then for her tolerance, and loved her now for not having been the doting, overly affectionate mother as some were inclined to be when raising alone a peculiar, if not mischievous, boy. Among all other things, she'd taught him to be self-reliant. Despite his strong independence, he missed her greatly. She lay nearby in Leighton Woods, in that tiny mountain cemetery, put there on an afternoon much like this one, the air hot and redolent with butterscotch. A confectioned aroma that has since become for him a grim reminder of the finality of things, of death, and its callous schedule. He stopped to dab his brow. At 8,700 feet, the climate was expectedly more temperate this time of year. The drone of cicadas urged him on, a strident buzz swelling and fading, swelling and fading. The chorus was disorienting, yet seductive in its resonance. A siren's song, similarly and lastly heard, he mused, when those fabled ship-flung sailors exhausted themselves treading water. Dario had long fancied himself an amateur entomologist, though would admit when pressed that it was more a love of aesthetics than nomenclature. His childhood fascination with insects led him, in adult life, to collect and mount them in creative and choreographed ways. Kaleidoscopic and floral-like compositions of the most striking iridescent wings and carapaces, deeply framed upon white canvas boards. Some arrangements strictly honored one pigment, one species, cortages of red milkweed beetles or neon-blue carousels of vivid damselflies, while others were dedicated to polychromatic tableaus, garlands of pipevine and tiger swallowtails arcing in flight, swirling eddies of dazzlingly white sulphur and raspberry moths. His hobby ultimately transitioned into a profitable business, and one to which he owed the taming of his irascible nature. A good many of the brilliantly coloured arthropods he chose for his projects were tropical, and therefore had to be acquired through insect farms and butterfly ranches from those regions, with some specimens demanding a hefty price. Customs officials frowned upon attempts to procure those formerly deemed endangered, but were most often than not willing to overlook those offences if the right amount of cash changed hands. A financial albatross at first, and to a smaller degree still, his artistic vision now had buyers from all over the world, more than willing to lessen that burden. For the prestige, one paid handsomely to own an original Dario Frey. Less than 10 feet away, motionless upon the trunk of a tree, Dario spotted what he'd come to collect. Okanaga bella, a mountain cicada. Perhaps not as exciting as its periodical brethren who emerge every 13 or 17 years. This one was of the annual variety, and its orange-on-black coloration and purple-tinged wings were just what he wanted, and he would need to collect 11 more to satisfy his next project. As he carefully approached the insect, the realization came over him that it wasn't any kind of cicada familiar to this region. And the closer he drew, the more he suspected that it wasn't any species of cicada he'd ever seen. Not on this continent, anyway. It was somewhat similar in size to the native species, but its wings were double the normal length, and reflected the light with a queerly mirror-like brilliance. Its protruding eyes were a deep magenta, vanguards upon an unusually thin and liquid black carapace, one supported by 6 legs that appeared too stout, speckled with orange, as if flecked with a painter's brush. The colour combination was exciting enough, but the potential for having discovered a new species was far more sensational in its implications, both scientific and commercial. Now, within 3 feet of the creature, he observed an eruption of soil at the base of the tree, and farther up the trunk, just inches from its prior tenant, clung the insect's brown, malted exoskeleton. With only one cicada showing, he knew there would soon be more nymphs emerging. Cicadas were docile insects and not particularly hard to gather up, especially the newly hatched kind, sunning in respite, drying on the bark. This part of the year found them in such emerging states, thus his timely efforts. This one didn't appear as being fresh from the soil, as its wings were straight and dry. Cage at the ready, he reached out his other hand to gingerly pluck the insect, and the moment his fingers touched that ebony body, A blackness enveloped him. Dario drew away, disoriented, nearly stumbling backward before his vision returned. He barely noticed the buzzing in his fingers before it faded away. Dazed, he took a moment to gather himself. "Am I having a stroke?" he wondered. Not likely, as the more he considered the lucid quality of the event, the more he was inclined to regard it as nothing more egregious than a dizzy spell, one likely motivated by dehydration, an explanation he was happy to embrace. He normally brought along a canteen when on safari, but this time had in his haste absent-mindedly left it in the car. He allowed a few moments for his heart to settle, then refocused his attention back on the insect. But it was no longer there. Searching the trunk, he found that it had skittered to the opposite side. Once again he leaned over and, upon touching it, experienced a new and more intense bout of darkness. Not even a plate of moonlight or star-filled night, but the blackest of that weave, draping to the ground. This episode lasted a few seconds longer than the first, and this time he wasn't so quick to dismiss it. Genuinely frightened now, heart racing anew, Dario inspected his fingers. That curious sensation again, yet this time more compelling. A litany of medical afflictions again raced through his mind, those of the cerebrovascular variety still front and center. After all, he was well into an age that consorted with those kinds of tragedies, and his family history was a roadmap showing him more susceptible to taking that same route. Just ask Mother. Still, he was not experiencing any degree of insentience, disruption of his thought processes, paralysis of limb or facial muscles, all products of ischemia. It was as if the sun had been switched off. That was ridiculous, of course, but it did get him thinking, especially about that tingling in his fingers. What if a mechanism of defense was the stimulus? It was no secret that some animals had the ability to deliver electrical shocks, such as certain eels, rays, and even amphibians. Water was a wonderful conductor, but he couldn't recall any arthropods, even the aquatic kind, being known to possess those talents. However, his knowledge of such things had atrophied over the years, an unfortunate consequence of advancing age. Regardless, it was a plausible theory, especially if this cicada was truly undocumented. After all, hundreds, if not thousands, of new arthropod species were discovered every year, more so than any other phylum, and some of those maligned characters were notorious for their adeptness, charlantry, and resilience. Did he dare try again to capture it? What if those first vaults had been just a forewarning, he wondered, followed up secondly with a harsher caveat? Would a third provocation guarantee something more painful, more enduring? Yes, a less personal approach might be the way. When his attention went back to the insect, his heart found a new reason to surge. It had again disappeared, hopefully only having dashed out of sight of its molester to another reachable section of tree. It had. Dario sighed with relief. His next attempt was the safer one, coaxing the bug to crawl onto the end of a loose stick, then gently easing it down into the metal cage. It worked splendidly, that successive and potentially more aggressive zinger avoided. He slapped shut the lid, then left the mountain with a profound sense of wonder, one not even the pitiless smell of butterscotch could spoil. Once down the mountain, he would immediately call his good friend and entomologist, Dr. Casper Cervantes. From atop one of the city's more impressive foothills, Dario's home peered out over its southern edge and down upon its busiest district, a contortion of railways, interstates, and lesser roads, all slipping in and out through one another in holiday bow fashion, if one was of the inclination to see it so festively. Dario never found his good friend Caspar to be of that persuasion, the incurably happy sort, but neither did he ever find him courting the other extreme, the profile of the rigid, white-coated academician, manifestly addicted to pie charts and boundless contemplation. Older than him by a handful of years, and as many inches taller, Caspar Cervantes was a layman's scholar, well-grounded in manner and appearance, domesticated to established theory, and most approachable. His only eccentricity, besides being able to lull a casual audience into tedium with his crowded intellect, was collecting prosthetic glass eyes. It was a side of the man Dario found uncharacteristically macabre. Dario's two-level bachelor residence denied him that stereotype, showcasing a modest array of Persian rugs and fine porcelains, with just enough frill to suggest that a woman had sneaked in at some point. Dario had never married, a prospect rich in claustrophobia, and one he intended to keep maintained at a safe distance. His hallways were shrines to his most intrepid works, his mentor's influence in many of them, and Caspar would always tour them first when over, his appreciation never seeming to wane. Today's visit was the exception to that rule. Staring down at the cage's unique resident, Dario couldn't help but smile along with his friend, who was beaming ear to ear and nodding with unrestrained joy, the same way a small child does when a trip to the carnival has been proposed. Dario made it clear that he didn't want Caspar handling the insect. This request had visibly struck his friend as mightily odd, but he continued to be the well-mannered guest, keeping his hands down at his sides. Clearly, it was killing him. Those wings. Yes, remarkably brilliant, Dario agreed. A proud find, Dario, Caspar said. Let's not break out the champagne just yet, but I am rather confident that our little friend here is unclassified. He finally tore his eyes away and turned them on the bug's incarcerator. Have you thought of a binomial name yet? Smiling even wider, Dario nodded that he had indeed. Well, Mosmontus noctus. Caspar winced at the sophomoric attempt. Yes, mountain for its origins, but night? Why so? Is it the collar? I was waiting to hear your verdict on its identity, or lack thereof, before presenting you with this next bit of excitement, Dario said, brimming delightedly. You see, I believe that this cicada has a unique defense. When touched, it administers something of an electrical shock. Or at least that's what I think it's administering, as electricity is the only thing I can imagine that would cause a momentary lapse of vision. Caspar's radiant smile darkened. Say again? I so far only touched it twice, but on each occasion felt tingly and was rendered sightless. Only a few seconds the first offense, mind you, but lasting quite a few more the next. Funny, it didn't feel exactly like traditional current, but then I've never been so similarly assaulted by an animal and therefore have no comparative frame of reference. He shrugged. There were obviously enough votes, though, to make its wishes known. It's amperes that kill, Casper said, attempting some levity. Besides, Dario, there's no insect, at least on record, that uses electricity as a defense. Chemicals, yes. Venom, yes. Pheromones, yes. Even bioluminescence, but electricity? No. Dario held up a finger. Yes, on record. Casper was shaking his head. I fear your little episodes are unrelated to anything this insect could manufacture, and certainly something you should address with your doctor should they continue. He chuckled. Remember, there is the cost versus benefit rule in insect defense. Simply, if the expenditure of a defensive mechanism exceeds the benefit, then it won't be passed down to the next generation, and the requirements necessary for any insect to maintain such a thing would be acutely burdening. Of course, there are other reasons factoring against such a theory, but suffice it to say, that's why nature has given us no examples of it in the arthropoda phylum. Then, as if to punctuate this very point, Casper reached into the cage. Just as he did, Dario grabbed his arm. Wait! Then, impenetrable darkness. Outside, in what was just moments earlier a bright and busy afternoon, pitch dark night pressed against the front window glass. And as Dario continued to stare in that direction, his mind's eye retained the ghost image of that rectangular frame, recalling the curtains as being parted and tied back midway, lending the memory the illusion of a knowing, sinister smile. And in the close distance beyond those panes was an interstate in the throes of rush-hour traffic, absent the blaring horns and sirens and collisions that would surely be the resulting cacophony of a sudden and most premature incursion of night. No car or adjacent streetlight shone in. No light of any kind sparkled or twinkled or flickered, inside or out, all suffused in a midnight consummé. Either the whole world had gone dark, or just his own eyes. His instinct was holding tenaciously to the former, a persistent notion that despite its being frighteningly unfathomable, was helping to slow what should have otherwise been a rapid descent into panic. Casper had gasped tellingly, but was yet to utter a word. That was all Dario needed to hear to know that his friend had, too, been blinded. He could hear him breathing steadily, could almost hear him thinking. So then, where are your damned eyes now? Dario finally asked, referring to Casper's creepy collection. That both had simultaneously been rendered blind was daunting enough in its insinuations. But as the phenomenon's duration continued to maturate, so did his anxiety. It wasn't time to panic, not yet, but it was fast approaching. Dario guessed that they'd now been in complete darkness for well into half a minute, and counting. In his surprise, Casper had dropped the insect. It landed on the tabletop, and Dario heard it scrabbling away, its chitinous legs swimming against the glass surface. It reached the edge and fell to the floor with a quiet thump, from where it continued its escape until it could no longer be heard. Both men stood motionless, grasping the backs of dining chairs, still caught in the immediate stasis of a blackout. Outside, the ambient sounds of an unmolested city continued to betray their situation, strongly indicating that they were the only recipients of this bizarre event. "Lights," Casper finally whispered, as if the bug were listening. "Find a switch." Dario fumbled for the nearest one, found it and flipped it up once, twice, a third time, but no radiance ensued.
That's interesting,
Caspar offered, downer now. Dario was already feeling his way to the adjoining kitchen, a search that grew more desperate by the moment. "Found it," he said, then cursed when the flashlight failed to produce even a dim glow. Caspar sighed.
Might you have some matches and a wick?"
"Candles, yes," Dario said, not liking the creeping resignation in his friend's voice. As Dario began another frantic search of his kitchen cabinetry, Caspar verified that he was indeed acquiescing to their unfortunate situation.
"I'm afraid power outages and full solar eclipses and biblical plagues of darkness offer little explanation for our predicament. We're going to have to accept the far grimmer possibility."
This last comment confirmed that Caspar had too, in those first moments, felt the darkness to be an external demonstration, but had since come to surrender that notion. Just then, Dario found the stove matches, fumbled with the box. There was nothing peculiar about the first match, and the flaring sound it made when struck, nor was there anything different about its acrid sulfur fumes. He could even feel upon his fingers the heat from its flame. He just couldn't see it. Dario shook it out, then lit another. This time he let it burn all the way to his fingers, and then endured the flame until he could no longer bear it, as if the pain might keep him fastened to a sane world quickly giving way to far worse alternatives. He turned to Caspar's lingering statement and said, "What did you have in mind?"
"Blindness, and of the short-lived variety, let's pray," Caspar said. "You were right about a defense mechanism, but electricity is certainly not the culprit here. Rather think phasmids."
"Of course, the American walking stick." Dario felt a bit embarrassed at not having already thought of that ideal example, an insect that was well known for spraying its aggressors with a potent chemical, one toxic enough to cause temporary blindness. But he quickly realized why such potentiality had been evading him. Pain, specifically, or rather its absence. Such an attack would cause severe irritation to the eyes, but he'd not experienced upon this or either of the two prior episodes even mild discomfort. Just that strange buzzing in his fingers. And he wasn't hearing Caspar cursing any distress either. Besides, the onset of his total blindness was too immediate. Where was that deteriorating interim between assault and complete loss of vision? And if the poison was a fast-acting enzyme or protein absorbed through the skin, that made some sense, up until this last attack, where he'd not touched the insect at all. He had been stricken just as he'd grabbed Caspar's arm, the very same moment the man picked up the insect. And that implied a transference, a conductivity, one that looped back to his initial theory of electricity. But now he wasn't even buying that as plausible. And because he'd had prior physical contact with the cicada, it would be the most amazing coincidence that he would suffer a relapse from that alleged contamination at the very same instant his friend was afflicted. He posited these concerns to Caspar, then proposed another, eccentric theory. "What about camouflage?"
"How so?"
Caspar said. His tone was more receptive than Dario had anticipated. Your first impulse was to turn on the lights. Mine too. It just strikes me that if this is a blindness brought about by the secretions of an insect, then its onset should not have been so effortlessly abrupt, so thoroughly engulfing. The lack of any sequence is rather curious, Casper calmly acknowledged. But Dario feared that his friend was only paying him a courtesy, and that there would be no pulling up Casper's pragmatic roots, as they were firmly entrenched. There's just this persuasive feeling, Dario continued, this nuance that what we're experiencing is being perceived on a different, less physical level. He sighed. Therefore, given this stubborn intuition, I'm growing more inclined to believe that this insect can inflict darkness. The transient kind, if I may take my recent experiences into account, those intervals having been directly proportional to the perceived level of threat, lasting just long enough for the cicada to dash out of sight. With your more aggressive handling of it, well, you pissed it off, is what I mean to suggest. Still with that tolerant tone, Casper said, Escape is exactly what it has accomplished, but only by conventional means. Your creative, if not fanciful, sensibilities are masquerading as logic and are providing your own wishful escape. Not at all surprising, given our grim prospects. Naturally, you'd want to ascribe this experience a brief and painless lifespan, certainly one with a happier ending. No, Dario, I'm afraid. Common sense and clearer heads must prevail here. Trust me, we have become, and yes, frighteningly so, the recipients of an arthropod's wrath. Nothing paranormal about that. Still, no, it's time we leave conjecture and start searching for that insect. If we've been poisoned with a neurological toxin and given our symptoms, I believe that may very well be the case. Then we need to capture that bug and make quick and proper arrangements to get it studied and for us to get to hospital. I'm beginning to fear that our only hope is for an antivenin. I don't want to discourage you even more, Dario, but if we are fortunate to have one made, it's not likely to reverse the damage already done, but will only prevent further harm. Our loss of vision may only be the first of many ailments yet to come. Just so you're prepared. Dario drew in a sharp breath. All right. You take the living room. I'll start in the kitchen. Upon Casper's request, Dario painstakingly navigated to a nearby hall closet and retrieved a box of surgical gloves, then dispensed each of them a pair. The gloves were used when handling some of his more exotic specimens chosen for display, not for his protection, but theirs, as his fingers' natural oils proved detrimental by dulling iridescences, lifting wing scales, tarnishing lusters. Now, on hands and knees, the two blinded men proceeded quietly and systematically about the wood floors, alert for specific sounds that would direct them to the insect's location. A quiver of membranous wing, a scratch of chitinous claw. After Dario finished with the kitchen, he progressed to the adjoining hallway, his intention to sidle the baseboards and continue a methodical sweep of the floor with his hands. It was stop and listen, stop and listen. As he searched, Dario began noticing that the darkness was subsiding, but only feebly. A peripheral adjustment so minor that he wasn't sure if his vision was returning, or it was just the glow of wishful thinking. It was so meager that he didn't feel it worth mentioning to Casper. Not yet. But it did give him renewed hope, and unsettling confidence that perhaps his exotic theory was worth reconsidering, that the longer the insect remained unmolested, the safer it began to feel, and thus Casper called out from the living room, a loud whisper. "I think I hear it." Now, at the opposite end of the hallway, Dario turned and braced his shoulder against the wall. Remaining on hands and knees, he moved determinedly towards his friend's voice. "Yes," Casper said, soft but assured. "I think it's on the curtains." Just as he reached the threshold of the living room, Dario sensed a measurable displacement of air, adding a dimensional quality to the darkness that seemed to take it to a new, more evolved stratum. From just a few feet away, a sound arose from the basement stairway. Heavy, stealthy. The sound of something large. Then those promising boundaries of his emergent vision once again yielded to inkier realms. "Dario?" Casper whispered. Dario did not answer, and in that breathless silence he heard the cicada rub its wings, a slow, deliberate chafing, as if contemplating outcomes. Dario noticed then a drifting aroma of butterscotch. "It's right above me," Casper said. Then, "Got it!" Upon Casper's exclamation, the stairway erupted with more determined sounds, intentioned sounds. Dario was certain now that whatever was there had reached the top steps. Then, from what was surely that very entry, came a low, predacious growl, as deep and paralyzing as the night that encapsulated them. "No!" Dario warned, confident now with his assumptions. "Let go of it!" As if waiting for that very decision to be made, the unseen thing hesitated, its throaty respirations thrumming against the blackness. Dario was sure that Casper was hearing it too, for he'd gone stone still, and just as quiet. The smell of butterscotch was overwhelming, as was what it implied. His heart pounding now, panic in full bloom, Dario said, "Just open the window and press out the screen!" Within the mercurial acoustics of a dream, the thing released an eerie caterwaul as it leaped from the stairway entrance, then set upon a predatory course toward the bug's present captor. Almost instantly, Dario perceived its impressive size as being utterly out of sync with its speed, as the distance between it and his friend should have been achieved in a single leap, yet the enduring clamor of pad and claw across the wood floor suggested that it was advancing by means of a hamster's wheel. Dario was reminded of the classic nightmare chase across a fog-bound moor, where the pursuer seems always to be in imminent, grasping reach of the dreamer's trudging heels. Until, finally, "Casper! I can't seem to move," Casper whispered. "For God's sake, set the damn thing loose!" As if to offer one last chance, the thing halted its determined approach and remained still in the fluid blackness. Only its slavering, cadenced breath gave away its position, one that Dario now imagined to be right at Casper's very feet. If not encouraged by Dario's verve, then certainly by the looming consequences of remaining idle, Casper found the handle, cranked open the window, then pressed the screen from its mooring. In moments, the cicada was heard to take to the wing, its noises receding swiftly away upon what Dario was confident to be illumined escape. There was not a gradual return of light, but an onslaught. Dario was blinking madly, and accompanying this brightness was an almost palpable warmth, one slowly thawing the nightmare gloom around him. Instinct was urging him to define this re-emergence as from a dream, but such a seething hallucination wasn't going to surrender its nocturnal temper so willingly, he feared, and certainly not to any fading memory. He found Casper leaning against the picture window, squinting, a mild summer breeze fluttering the lace curtains. Whatever had been nearly upon his friend was gone, had perhaps slunk back down into the murk that had been giving it asylum. For a very long moment, both men stared at each other. "It appears that I may have to concede to your imaginative side," Casper finally said, his tone authenticating a reluctance to do so. "In what way?" Dario said, returning shakily to his feet. "Think Filidae. Leaf mimics. Indeed, the grandest of morphological strategies. Those insects mimic their foliage down to the minutest detail. Shape, color, texture, veining. Some to the extraordinary efforts of appearing gnawed upon by caterpillars. They even parody the wind as they move about, rocking and swaying as if in a breeze." Nodding, Dario was staring past his friend and out the window. Remarkable camouflage. "Yes," Casper said, curiously grim. "Camouflage." Then, reflecting upon a more esoteric demeanor, "When long immersed in the night, we are left no other option but to prepare for its denizens, especially those birthed from the basement of our perpetual anxiety. Our escapist battle with them is, in a way, I suppose, our species' own mimicry defense. We become the impersonations of our deepest fears, and hope that, like the leafhopper, they don't recognize us as we sit trembling on the branch." "Did you smell anything peculiar?" Dario asked. Casper stared at him quizzically, an expression that struck Dario as being oddly incompatible with the lingering bizarreness. "No," Casper said. "Nothing at all." He pulled the gloves from his hands, then, as if reason were a scheduled train, he glanced at his wristwatch and said, "Shall we call it a day, then?" From the approaching distance, it appeared as if the trees had anticipated his intentions, and to deny him the pleasure had set themselves afire until thoroughly scorched. But it was only the thick infestations of a black and undocumented cicada that covered their trunks. Inflicting darkness was only part of their defense, was only cover for things far crueler, more remorseless, more dangerous. Our most indomitable fears, always on the prowl. The forest's sepulchral aroma of butterscotch was again strong today, as if in defiance, perhaps to remind him that his inevitable end would arrive just as spontaneously. He set aside the gas can, then looked in the direction of the cemetery, his mother's final resting place, just over the ridge and out of sight. Nothing that he was about to do would destroy her memory. He recalled his friend's tragic inference that, when crouched within the night, we are but interlopers in our own infected minds. Then he commenced setting the mountain in enduring light. A Mimicry of Night by Jon Michael Kelley. Well, I suppose it's time for us to buzz off. You have been listening to Nocturnal Transmissions. This transmission was brought to you with the generous assistance of our Patreon subscribers. A particular thank you goes out to our esteemed cohorts: Alex Brewis, Rachel Brown, Tippy Polo, Fabled Words, Adam, Arnie Frank, Sam Hankins, The Traveller, Evan Dooley, Alexis Nolasco, Thomas Arvin, Azaran Warrens, J.B. Wildy, Brett Allen, Rebecca Gates, Robert Troy Hampton Peterson, Daniel Clanton. Shh. Just listen. Wayne Prince, Mudkip, Kel Wielden, Boole Swivney, Daniel Kamienkowski, and Alicia Townsend. Before we leave you, we would like to welcome a brand new acolyte to our ranks of Patreon supporters. Dave Baxter. Welcome aboard, Dave. Hope you're enjoying the exclusive episodes. P.S. Just between you and me, there's another big serialized presentation on its way very soon. One of the all-time cosmic horror classics. Don't tell the others. All non-public domain stories are featured with the permission of the authors. All voices and production are concocted by Kristin Holland. Until next time, as always, watch the skies, fear the dark, and don't trust anyone. Especially yourself. Good night, gentle listener.